I'm Natalie, 42, and for 3 years I've lived on my modest widow's pension while my late husband's family treated me like their charity case. At every family gathering, the snide comments about my government handouts and pitying glances at my thrift store clothes became routine. My sister-in-law would loudly discuss vacation plans I couldn't afford, while my mother-in-law would slip me grocery store gift cards with that condescending smile. They saw me as the poor widow who trapped their golden boy before he died too young. But what they didn't know was that my husband had secrets, big ones. Last week, his attorney finally contacted me about a trust fund he established just months before his accident. The family that mocked my pension, they're about to discover that the charity case they've been supporting actually inherited more than all of them combined. If you've ever been underestimated by those who should love you most, like and subscribe to hear what happened next. 3 years ago, I stood in that sterile funeral home watching my husband's family transform before my eyes. The funeral guest book sits on my kitchen table now, its pages yellowed with time. But I remember exactly who signed it and, more importantly, who didn't bother to show up. When my husband was alive, I was part of the inner circle. His mother would call me daily, his sister invited me to girls' weekends, and his cousins always made sure I had a seat at family dinners. But the moment the casket closed, something shifted. It wasn't immediate. Grief has a way of masking other emotions at first. But within weeks, the calls stopped coming. The invitations dried up. I became an outsider looking in at the family I thought I belonged to. His sister Brenda had been the first to show her true colors. At the reception following the service, she cornered me near the dessert table with her fake sympathetic voice. "You know, Natalie, if you ever need anything financial help, someone to talk to are here for you." The way she emphasized financial help made my stomach turn, as if my grief was somehow tied to money, as if that was my primary concern. While my world crumbled around me, his mother was more subtle but equally cruel. She started treating me like a fragile child who couldn't handle adult conversations. During family gatherings, she'd pull me aside with hushed tones. "How are you managing, dear? Are you eating enough? Do you need help with the bills?" Always the bills. Always the assumption that I was helpless without her son's income. What they didn't understand, what they refused to see, was that I had been managing just fine. My husband and I had lived modestly by choice, not necessity. He had always been secretive about our finances, handling everything himself, while I focused on my part-time work at the local library. I trusted him completely, never questioning his decisions or asking for detailed explanations about our financial situation. The guest book told a story of selective grief. His childhood friends had driven hours to pay their respects. My family had filled an entire row despite having to take time off work and arrange childcare. But his wealthy uncle, the one who owned 3 restaurants and always bragged about his investment portfolio, his name was notably absent. His cousin, who lived just 20 minutes away and claimed to be like a brother to my husband, nowhere to be found. Looking back, I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The way family photos from gatherings I attended mysteriously never included me in the final versions shared on social media. The way birthday parties and celebrations were scheduled and planned without anyone bothering to tell me until the last minute, if at all. But grief has a way of making you doubt everything, including your own perceptions. When you're drowning in loss, you don't always notice who's throwing you a lifeline and who's standing on the shore watching you struggle. You're grateful for any kindness, even when it comes wrapped in condescension. My monthly budget notebook became my Bible after the funeral expenses were settled and reality set in. Every dollar had to be accounted for, every expense justified. The widow's pension I received was enough to cover basic necessities, but it left no room for the life I had once known. $842. That's what I had left each month after rent, utilities, and insurance. I wrote that number at the top of every page in my notebook, a constant reminder of my limitations. Groceries got $60 a week. No exceptions. I learned to shop sales, clip coupons, and stretch every ingredient into multiple meals. The fancy organic produce I once bought without thinking became a luxury. I couldn't justify. My wardrobe transformed from the department store clothes my husband had always encouraged me to buy 2 thrift store finds and clearance rack discoveries. I became an expert at finding barely worn designer pieces hidden among the donated items. Learning to spot quality fabric and timeless cuts that could carry me through multiple seasons. What I couldn't find secondhand, I simply went without. Entertainment became free activities. Library books instead of bookstore purchases. Hiking trails instead of gym memberships. Cooking at home instead of restaurants. I learned to find joy in small things. A perfectly ripe peach, marked down for quick sale. A 25-cent hardcover book that had been on my reading list for years. A sunny afternoon in the park with nothing but time to think. The hardest part wasn't the financial constraints, it was the shame that came with them. When family invitations did arrive, they were often for expensive restaurants or events I couldn't afford. "Don't worry about money," Brenda would say when I politely declined. "We can spot you." The word spot always stung, as if I were a teenager, short on allowance money, not a grown woman managing her own finances with dignity. The grocery store gift cards started appearing around month 6. His mother would slip them to me during visits, always with the same patronizing smile. "I found this in my purse and thought you might be able to use it," she'd say, as if $25 to the local supermarket had simply materialized in her designer handbag. The cards themselves were artifacts of their perception of me: practical, basic, and utterly lacking in imagination or respect for my autonomy. I kept every single card in a small wooden box on my kitchen counter, even after using them. Looking at them reminded me of something important. I was surviving. More than surviving, I was learning who I really was when stripped of the financial security I had taken for granted. I discovered strength I didn't know I possessed: creativity, born from necessity, and a fierce independence that surprised even me. But the family saw none of this growth, this quiet resilience. They saw only limitation, only lack. They measured my worth by my bank account balance and found me wanting. What they didn't realize was that I was measuring them too and finding them lacking in qualities that mattered far more than money. The holiday photo album sits in my living room, though I rarely open it anymore. Its pages tell a story of gradual erasure, my presence fading from family gatherings like a ghost slowly disappearing from film. In the early photos, right after my husband's death, I'm still there in the group shots, still included in the candid moments. But as the months passed, I noticed my absence more than my presence. Thanksgiving dinner 18 months ago was when I first realized how completely my status had changed. I arrived at his mother's house carrying a homemade sweet potato casserole, the same recipe I'd brought for 5 years running. But instead of the warm greeting I expected, I was met with surprise. "Oh, Natalie, you came," Brenda said, as if my attendance at a family gathering was somehow optional or unexpected. The seating arrangement told me everything I needed to know. I found myself relegated to the card table with the teenagers, while my usual spot at the main table, the seat beside where my husband used to sit, was occupied by Brenda's new boyfriend. When I mentioned it quietly to his mother, she patted my arm dismissively. "We thought you'd be more comfortable with the young people, dear. Less pressure to keep up with all our boring adult conversation." The conversation at that main table, which I could hear perfectly from my exile, revolved around stock portfolios, real estate investments, and vacation planning. Brenda announced her plans for a Mediterranean cruise with an enthusiasm that seemed deliberately amplified for my benefit. 3 weeks in Europe," she gushed. "We're doing the full tour: Italy, Greece, Turkey. Of course it's terribly expensive, but you only live once, right?" His cousin Mark chimed in with details about his family's new lake house, complete with a boat and jet skis. "You should all come up this summer," he said, his eyes deliberately avoiding mine. "We have plenty of room for everyone who can make it." The emphasis on who can make it wasn't lost on anyone at either table. The gift exchange was the cruelest part. I watched as family members exchanged expensive presents: cashmere scarves, jewelry, electronics, gift certificates to high-end restaurants. When it came time for my gifts to be opened, the patronizing smiles said everything. I had spent weeks crafting personalized photo albums for each family, filled with pictures of my husband and memories we had shared together. The albums were met with polite thank yous and quick placement aside, clearly viewed as the desperate offerings of someone who couldn't afford real presents. But it was the gifts I received that hurt the most. A collection of dollar store candles from Brenda, a generic World's Greatest Aunt mug from Mark's family, despite the fact that my husband and I never had children, making me nobody's aunt in their family, and from his mother, a self-help book titled Starting Over, A Guide to Finding Happiness. After loss, the message was clear: I needed fixing, and they were generously providing the tools. The final insult came during dessert. His mother stood up to make her annual toast to family, but this year's version had a new addition. "Let's remember those we've lost," she said, raising her wine glass, "and let's support those among us who are struggling to find their way." Her eyes landed directly on me during the word struggling, and I felt every gaze in the room follow suit. That night, I went home and removed every family photo from my refrigerator, every group shot from my mantelpiece. I couldn't bear to look at my own face in those pictures anymore, the hopeful smile of someone who still believed she belonged. Somewhere she clearly didn't. My wedding ring never left my finger, even 3 years after his death. But it wasn't until last month, when I was cleaning it with jewelry polish, that I noticed the tiny engraving on the inside band. The letters were so small, I needed a magnifying glass to read them: Forever Protected J. The J stood for Jonathan, my husband's name, but the word protected puzzled me. Protected from what? We met at a bookstore coffee shop 7 years ago. I was reading during my lunch break when he approached my table, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Mind if I join you? Every other table is taken. It was a lie, half the cafe was empty, but his smile was so genuine I didn't care. He ordered the same unusual drink I was having, claiming it looked interesting, though I later learned he hated chai lattes and only pretended to enjoy it to keep our conversation going. Jonathan was different from anyone I had ever dated. Where other men were eager to impress me with stories of their accomplishments or possessions, he seemed more interested in learning about my thoughts, my dreams, my fears. He asked about books I loved, places I wanted to travel, and memories that shaped who I was. Our first date lasted 6 hours because neither of us wanted it to end. What struck me most about Jonathan was his quiet confidence. He never boasted about his work as a software consultant, never mentioned the clients he worked with or the projects he completed. When I asked about his day, he would deflect the conversation back to me or suggest we take a walk instead of talking about work. I spend enough time thinking about business during business hours, he'd say. I'd rather spend our time thinking about us. He was incredibly private about money in a way that seemed refreshingly humble rather than secretive. When we went out to dinner, he never made a show of paying the bill or choosing expensive restaurants to impress me. We often ate at small neighborhood places or cooked together at one of our apartments. He drove a modest sedan that was several years old, but well maintained. His clothes were nice but not flashy. Everything about his lifestyle suggested someone who lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Even after we married, Jonathan handled all our finances, not because he didn't trust me or because he was controlling, but because he genuinely enjoyed it and seemed to have a gift for managing money. It's like a puzzle to me, he'd explain when I occasionally asked about our investments or savings. I like making the numbers work in our favor. He would show me our monthly statements and explain our budget, but I was happy to let him take the lead on financial planning while I focused on other aspects of our life together. His family's wealth was something I learned about gradually. They never flaunted it around me, but I began to notice details: the expensive cars in the driveway during family gatherings, the casual mentions of investment properties and business ventures, the way they never seemed concerned about the cost of anything. Jonathan would sometimes grow quiet after family dinners, and when I asked him about it, he'd say things like, "Money changes people," or, "I'm glad we've built something real together." Looking back, I wonder if he sensed something about his family's true nature that I was too naive to see. He often made comments about protecting what mattered most, about ensuring that our relationship was built on genuine connection rather than material circumstances. "I want you to love me for who I am, not what I have," he told me during one of our deeper conversations before we married. The ring's engraving now made more sense. Jonathan had been protecting me from his family's judgment, from their materialistic values, from the burden of wealth that might have changed how they saw me or how I saw myself. He created a simple life for us, one where love mattered more than money, where our connection was based on who we were as people rather than what we owned. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was sorting through coupon inserts at my kitchen table. The number wasn't familiar, and I almost let it go. To voicemail solicitors had become increasingly persistent lately, somehow sensing my vulnerable financial status like sharks detecting blood in water. "Mrs. Natalie Thompson." The voice was professional, crisp, and carried the kind of authority that made me sit up straighter in my chair. "This is she," I replied carefully, already mentally preparing to decline whatever service or product was being offered. "This is Harold Morrison from Morrison Sterling and Associates. I apologize for the delay in contacting you, but I've been attempting to locate you regarding your late husband's estate. Do you have a few minutes to discuss some important matters?" My heart stopped. Estate matters. 3 years after Jonathan's death, I thought everything had been settled. We had gone through probate, distributed his few possessions, closed his accounts. What could possibly be left to discuss? "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some mistake," I said slowly. "My husband's estate was settled years ago. There wasn't much to settle, actually." I heard papers rustling on the other end of the line, followed by a pause that seemed to stretch forever. "Mrs. Thompson, I have in front of me documents establishing a substantial trust fund created by your husband approximately 6 months before his death. This trust was designed to remain private and inaccessible for a specific period of time, which has now expired. I'm afraid this matter is quite complex and really should be discussed in person." The business card he insisted on sending by courier arrived within 2 hours. Morrison, Sterling and Associates. The paper was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that spoke of serious money and serious legal work. The address was in the financial district downtown, in one of those glass towers I had always assumed were filled with people who lived in a completely different world than mine. I stared at that card for the rest of the day, turning it over in my hands like a talisman that might reveal its secrets through touch alone. Harold Morrison, senior partner, estate and trust law. The phone number had too many digits, including what looked like a direct extension. This wasn't some general practice lawyer who handled divorces and minor disputes. Jonathan and I lived modestly. Our biggest joint purchase had been our used Honda Civic. We rented a small apartment, shopped at discount stores, and considered dinner at chain restaurants a special occasion. The most valuable thing my husband owned was his laptop computer, which I had donated to the library after his death because I couldn't bear to use it myself, unless I found myself remembering odd moments from our marriage with new eyes. The way Jonathan sometimes received phone calls that he would take in another room, speaking in hushed tones about investments and portfolios. The way he occasionally mentioned putting money aside for our future but would change the subject when I asked for details. Never using a financial advisor or accountant, always saying he preferred to keep things simple. Maybe things weren't as simple as I had believed. The attorney wanted to meet Friday afternoon at his office 3 days away. 3 days to imagine possibilities I had never dared consider. 3 days to worry that this was somehow a cruel mistake or, worse, some kind of elaborate scam targeting vulnerable widows. But the business card felt real in my hands, solid and substantial, and something in Harold Morrison's voice had carried the weight of truth, the careful precision of a man who dealt in facts rather than fantasies. Morrison, Sterling & Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower that made me feel underdressed despite wearing my best outfit, a navy dress I had found at a consignment shop and a pair of heels that had seen better days. The lobby featured marble floors, original artwork, and furniture that probably cost more than my annual income. Harold Morrison met me personally at the elevator, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing for you." He led me to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, gesturing to a leather chair across from his mahogany desk. "Before we begin," he said, settling into his chair, "I want to assure you that everything we discuss today is completely confidential. Your husband was very specific about privacy being paramount in all matters related to this trust." He opened a thick file folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the desk like cards in a complex game I didn't understand. The papers were official-looking, covered in legal terminology, and bearing multiple signatures and notary seals. "Your husband established the Jonathan Thompson Irrevocable Trust in February, 8 months before his death," Morrison explained, his finger tracing lines of text across the first document. "This trust was funded with assets from various sources: investments, stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights. The trust was designed to remain private and inaccessible for a period of 3 years following your husband's death, with all benefits reverting to you as the sole beneficiary after that waiting period expired." I stared at the papers, the legal language swimming before my eyes. "I don't understand." Jonathan and I lived very modestly. We didn't have stock portfolios or real estate holdings. We rented our apartment. We drove a used car. Morrison's expression was gentle but serious. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband was an extremely successful software developer and consultant. His work with several major corporations generated substantial royalties and licensing fees. Additionally, he made some very shrewd investments over the years, particularly in emerging technologies and startup companies. He was, quite frankly, a wealthy man who chose to live well below his means." The room seemed to tilt around me. "How wealthy?" Morrison consulted another document before looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The current value of the trust, including all accumulated interest and dividends over the past 3 years, is approximately $18.7 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, certain I had misheard. 18 million, that's impossible." "I understand your shock," Morrison said quietly, "but I assure you, these figures have been verified by multiple accountants and financial institutions. Your husband was extremely methodical in his planning. He anticipated your reaction, actually." He reached into the folder and withdrew an envelope with my name written in Jonathan's familiar handwriting. "He asked me to give you this when I revealed the trust's existence. He thought you might need his own words to help you understand." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in my husband's neat script. "My dearest Natalie, if you're reading this, then Harold has told you about the trust, and you're probably feeling shocked and confused. I kept this secret from you not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to protect our happiness from the complications that money can bring. I saw what wealth did to my family, the jealousy, the manipulation, the way it changed how people saw each other and themselves. I wanted us to build a life based on love, not luxury. I wanted you to know that I chose you for who you are, not what you could give me or what I could provide for you. The 3-year waiting period was designed to ensure that your grief wasn't complicated by sudden wealth, and to give you time to discover your own strength and independence. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more deserving of happiness than you realize. This money is yours now, to use as you see fit. But please remember that your worth was never measured in dollars. It was measured in the joy you brought to my life every single day. Love, always, Jonathan. Tears fell onto the letter, blurring the ink slightly. Morrison tactfully pretended not to notice, busying himself with organizing the remaining documents while I composed myself. There are some practical matters we need to discuss, he said eventually. Tax implications, transfer procedures, investment management options, but those can wait until you've had time to process this information. For now, I just need you to sign a few acknowledgement forms confirming that you've been informed of the trust's existence. I signed where he indicated, my hand moving automatically while my mind reeled with the implications of what I had learned. $18 million. More money than I had ever imagined possessing, sitting in accounts I hadn't known existed, managed by people I had never met. All orchestrated by a husband whose depth of planning and foresight astounded me. I drove home in a daze, Jonathan's letter folded carefully in my purse like a sacred document. Every traffic light, every turn, every familiar landmark looked different somehow, as if learning about the trust had changed the fundamental nature of reality itself. $18.7 million. The number felt surreal, like something from a movie or a dream rather than my actual life. At home, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had carefully budgeted every penny for 3 years, and read Jonathan's letter again. His words revealed a depth of understanding about his own family that I had never fully grasped during our marriage. He had seen their flaws clearly, had recognized how money corrupted their relationships and poisoned their interactions with others. I saw what wealth did to my family, the jealousy, the manipulation, the way it changed how people saw each other and themselves. His insight was painful in its accuracy. I thought about Brenda's condescending comments, his mother's patronizing charity, the way they had gradually excluded me from their lives while simultaneously treating me like a burden they were graciously willing to bear. They hadn't just been cruel, they had been hypocritical. All those snide remarks about my government handouts and my modest lifestyle, all those pitying looks and charitable gestures had come from people who assumed I was poor because Jonathan had been poor. They had measured his worth by their perception of his financial status, and when they thought that status was low, they had written both of us off as lesser members of the family. The revelation brought a mix of emotions that left me feeling dizzy and disoriented. Relief that Jonathan had loved me enough to protect our relationship from the corrupting influence of wealth. Grief that he had felt the need to hide such a fundamental aspect of his life from me. Anger that his family had treated me so poorly based on their own assumptions and prejudices. And underneath it all, a growing sense of empowerment that I wasn't sure how to handle. For 3 years I had accepted their treatment of me because I believed it reflected reality. I was the poor widow, dependent on their occasional kindness, grateful for their minimal attention. I had internalized their assessment of my worth, and shaped my behavior around their expectations. I had made myself smaller, quieter, more grateful, more apologetic, because I believed that was my proper place in their hierarchy. But that hierarchy had been built on a lie. I wasn't the charity case they believed me to be. I wasn't the burden they had grudgingly accepted into their family. Was the widow of a man who had been far more successful than any of them realized, and I was now wealthier than all of them combined. The power dynamic they had established and maintained for 3 years was not just cruel-lit, was completely backwards. The temptation for revenge was immediate and intoxicating. I fantasized about showing up at the next family gathering in designer clothes, casually mentioning expensive purchases, letting them know exactly how wrong they had been about my circumstances. I imagined their faces when they realized that the woman they had been patronizing was actually in a position to buy and sell them several times over. But Jonathan's letter tempered my anger with wisdom. He had kept this secret not to spite his family or to set up some elaborate long-term revenge scheme, but to protect something precious: our authentic relationship, built on genuine connection rather than financial considerations. He had wanted me to love him for who he was, not what he had. And in protecting that love, he had also protected my own integrity and independence. The 3-year waiting period now made perfect sense. It had forced me to discover my own strength, to learn who I was when stripped of external validation or support. I had survived more than survived. I had grown. I had learned to budget carefully, to find joy in simple pleasures, to appreciate genuine kindness and recognize hollow gestures. I had developed resilience, creativity, and a fierce independence that I might never have found if I had been wealthy from the start. Jonathan had given me something far more valuable than money. He had given me the opportunity to discover my own worth apart from material circumstances. And now, armed with both that self-knowledge and financial security, I faced a choice about how to use both gifts. Knowledge, I decided, would be my first weapon. If I was going to confront Jonathan's family about their treatment of me, I needed to understand their own financial situation. I needed to know whether their cruelty came from genuine ignorance or from something darker and more calculating. I spent the next week conducting research that would have made a private investigator proud. The internet was remarkably revealing once you knew where to look. Property records, business licenses, court filings, social media posts, all of it painted a picture that was both surprising and oddly satisfying. Brenda's Mediterranean cruise, it turned out, had been financed through a second mortgage on her house. Her husband's construction business was struggling with several liens filed against their property for unpaid suppliers. The expensive restaurants she favored were often visited during happy hour specials or with discount coupons. Her designer handbags, which she carried so proudly to family gatherings, were mostly high-quality knockoffs, purchased from online retailers. Mark's lake house was impressive until I discovered it was actually a timeshare arrangement with 3 other families, each paying monthly fees they could barely afford. His boat had been repossessed 6 months ago, though he continued to post old photos on social media to maintain the illusion of prosperity. His investment portfolio, which he mentioned so frequently, was actually a modest 401k that had lost significant value in recent market fluctuations. Jonathan's mother presented the most complex picture. Her house was paid off, and she had some genuine assets, but her income was largely dependent on Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's job. Her expensive gifts to other family members often came at the cost of her own financial security. She had been using credit cards to maintain her generous image, accumulating debt that she struggled to manage on her fixed income. The grocery store gift cards she had been giving me, those symbols of her charitable condescension, represented a genuine financial sacrifice on her part, not because she couldn't afford $25, but because she had been choosing to help me instead of addressing her own mounting credit card balances. This information created a file, one labeled Family Financial Investigation, though I never intended to use it maliciously. Understanding their situation helped me understand their behavior. They hadn't been cruel out of genuine superiority. They had been cruel out of insecurity and fear. They had been desperately trying to maintain an image of prosperity while struggling with their own financial pressures, and treating me as lesser had been their way of feeling better about their own circumstances. My research revealed something else. They genuinely believed Jonathan had died without assets. His secretive nature about finances, combined with our modest lifestyle, had convinced them that we had been living paycheck to paycheck just as they were. Their assumption that I needed their charity wasn't entirely malicious. It was based on their understanding of my situation as they perceived it. This knowledge complicated my feelings about revenge. These weren't wealthy people treating a poor relative badly out of snobbery or genuine contempt. These were struggling people who had used me as a way to feel superior about their own difficult circumstances. Their cruelty was still inexcusable, but it was rooted in their own pain and insecurity rather than in actual malice or genuine belief in their own superiority. Understanding their motivations didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me plan a response that was strategic, rather than simply reactive. I didn't want to destroy them financially or emotionally. I wanted them to understand the harm they had caused, and to face the consequences of their assumptions and prejudices. The charity gala was perfect. The annual fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, scheduled for next month, was exactly the kind of event where their pretensions would be on full display. It was expensive enough that they would assume I couldn't attend, public enough that any revelations would have maximum impact, and meaningful enough that I could use it as an opportunity to do genuine good while making my point. I began planning my approach with the same methodical care that Jonathan had used in creating the trust. This wouldn't be about humiliating them. It would be about revealing the truth and giving them an opportunity to choose how they wanted to respond to that truth. The invitation to the Children's Hospital Gala arrived in my mailbox, exactly as I expected, forwarded from Brenda's address with a sticky note attached. "Thought you might like to see what we're supporting this year," she had written in her careful script. "Tickets are $200 per person, so obviously we understand if you can't make it." The passive-aggressive kindness was perfectly Brenda. She got to feel generous for sharing the invitation while simultaneously reminding me of my presumed financial limitations. The sticky note was an artifact of their condescension, A small piece of paper that perfectly captured how they saw our relationship, them as the generous benefactors, me as the grateful recipient of their occasional attention. $200 per ticket. For them, it probably represented a stretch expensive enough to make them feel sophisticated and charitable, costly enough that they'd need to budget carefully or use credit cards they couldn't quite afford to pay off immediately. For me, with $18 million in accessible accounts, it was less than pocket change. I called Harold Morrison to arrange the transfer of funds into a checking account I could access immediately. "How much would you like transferred?" he asked. $200,000 to start, I replied, enjoying the words more than I probably should have. I may need more depending on how the evening goes. The gala was 3 weeks away, giving me time to prepare carefully. I needed the right dress, something elegant but not flashy, expensive but not obviously so. I needed to arrive in a way that would raise questions without providing immediate answers. Most importantly, I needed a strategy that would maximize impact while maintaining dignity. I found the perfect dress at an upscale boutique I had never dared enter during my pension years. The saleswoman was initially cool until I handed her my credit card without asking about prices or looking for sale items. Her attitude shifted dramatically when the card approved a $3,000 purchase without hesitation. "Will you be needing shoes and accessories to complete the look?" she asked, suddenly eager to be helpful. "Yes," I said simply. "Whatever you think works best. Price isn't a concern." The shoes were Italian leather, the handbag was designer, and the jewelry was understated but clearly expensive. The total came to nearly $8,000 more money than I had spent on clothes in the previous 3 years combined. But every purchase felt like an investment in justice, a tool in a larger strategy. I arranged for a car service to take me to the gala, not a limousine that would be too obvious, but a high-end sedan with a professional driver who would wait outside. All evening, I wanted to arrive and depart in a way that suggested resources without being flashy about them. The psychological preparation was more complex than the practical arrangements. For 3 years, I had conditioned myself to think small, to apologize for taking up space, to be grateful for minimal attention. Now I needed to reclaim a sense of dignity and self-worth that I had almost forgotten I possessed. I practiced conversations in my mirror, trying different tones and approaches. Too aggressive would make me look bitter. Too subtle might miss the mark entirely. I needed to find the sweet spot where truth could be revealed naturally, where their own assumptions would trap them more effectively than any accusation I could make. The key was patience. I wouldn't reveal everything at once. That would be dramatic, but ultimately less satisfying than letting them expose their own prejudices gradually. I would let them make their usual assumptions, offer their usual condescending comments, and dig themselves deeper into the hole they had been building for 3 years. Only then would I begin to show them exactly how wrong they had been about everything. The day before the gala, I received a call from Natalie. "I hope you got our invitation. I know these events can be expensive, but we'd love to have you join us if you can manage it. Maybe we could spot you for the ticket price. Consider it an early birthday present." "That's very kind of you, Brenda," I replied carefully, "but I've already purchased my ticket. I'm looking forward to supporting such a worthy cause." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. She had expected me to decline or to accept her charity. My simple statement that I had already handled the matter myself clearly didn't compute with her understanding of my situation. "Oh," she said finally. "Well, that's wonderful. I'm sure you're excited about dressing up for such a fancy evening." "I am," I agreed. "I found the perfect outfit. I think everyone will be surprised." That, at least, was absolutely true. The morning of the gala, I woke before dawn and spent an hour reading Jonathan's letter again, drawing strength from his words about my worth being measured in joy rather than dollars. Today would be about reclaiming that worth, not through cruelty or revenge, but through quiet dignity and truth. The new designer dress hung in my closet like a battle uniform, still bearing its tags that had become artifacts of my transformation. $3,000 for a single garment, more than I had spent on clothes in entire years during my pension period. But the price wasn't what mattered, it was what the dress represented. It was armor made of silk and confidence, a visual statement that I was no longer the person they thought they knew. I took my time getting ready, treating each step as a meditation on change. The professional makeup artist I had hired, another expense that would have been unthinkable months ago, transformed my appearance subtly but dramatically. My skin glowed, my eyes sparkled, and my features were enhanced in ways that suggested natural beauty rather than artificial enhancement. "You have lovely bone structure," she said as she worked. "Have you ever considered professional photography? You have such an elegant presence." Elegant. The word felt foreign but wonderful. For 3 years I had felt invisible, diminished, apologetic for taking up space. Today I would be seen. The hairstylist arrived next, creating an updo that was sophisticated without being severe, polished without being stiff. As I watched my reflection change in the mirror, I felt like I was meeting a version of myself that had been hidden for years, not just during my widowhood, but perhaps for much longer. My phone rang while I was getting dressed. "Natalie, dear, it's Jonathan's mother. I wanted to check on you before tonight. Are you sure you're comfortable attending such a formal event? I'd hate for you to feel out of place." The concern in her voice was genuine, which made it both touching and infuriating. She truly believed she was being kind, protecting me from potential embarrassment. She couldn't imagine that I might belong at such an event, that I might be comfortable in expensive settings, that I might have resources she knew nothing about. "Thank you for thinking of me," I replied carefully, "but I'm actually looking forward to it. I think it will be a very enlightening evening for everyone involved. Well, if you need anything, if you feel overwhelmed or out of place, just find one of us. We'll make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. Like a child at an adult party, like someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment. The unconscious condescension was so deeply ingrained that she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I have a feeling I'll be just fine on my own tonight." The car service arrived precisely at 6:30, the driver professional and courteous as he held the door for me. As we drove through the city toward the hotel where the gala was being held, I practiced the conversations I might have, the questions I might ask, the responses I would give to their inevitable assumptions and comments. But more than that, I practiced simply being present in my own skin, owning my space, refusing to apologize for existing or for having opinions or for deserving respect. The hardest part wouldn't be revealing the truth about the trust. Fund it would be unlearning 3 years of conditioning that had taught me to make myself smaller for other people's comfort. The hotel was magnificent. All marble and crystal, and understated elegance. As the driver helped me from the car, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Poised, confident, beautifully dressed, she looked like someone who belonged. "In places like this, what time should I return for you, ma'am?" the driver asked. "I'm not sure," I replied honestly. "It depends on how long it takes for people to adjust to some new information. But don't wait. I'll call when I'm ready." As I walked toward the hotel entrance, I felt Jonathan's presence with me, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a source of strength. He had loved me enough to protect me from the very people I was about to face. Now it was time to protect myself and, maybe if I was lucky, to help them understand the difference between charity and cruelty, between generosity and condescension, between loving someone and controlling them. Tonight would change everything. The only question was whether it would change it for the better. The hotel ballroom was exactly what I had expected: crystal chandeliers, white linens, and an atmosphere of cultivated elegance that spoke of serious money supporting serious causes. I paused in the entrance, taking in the scene and allowing myself to be seen in return. The valet parking ticket in my small clutch was more than just a receipt. It was evidence of a lifestyle that nobody in Jonathan's family thought I could afford. I spotted them immediately. Brenda held court near the silent auction tables, gesturing dramatically while describing something to a small group of listeners. Mark and his wife stood by the bar, both nursing what looked like the cheapest drinks available. Jonathan's mother sat at their reserved table, looking elegant but tired, probably already calculating how much this evening was costing her on her fixed income. None of them noticed my entrance initially, which gave me the advantage of observing their behavior before they adjusted it for my benefit. They looked exactly as I expected, dressed well but not expensively, playing their parts as successful family members while carefully managing their spending. Brenda saw me first, and her expression shifted through several stages of confusion, recognition, surprise, puzzlement, and finally a kind of suspicious curiosity. I watched her lean over to Mark, whispering something that made him turn and stare directly at me. "Natalie." Brenda approached with her usual air of concern mixed with superiority. "You look different. That's quite a dress." "Thank you," I replied simply, allowing her to process whatever she was trying to figure out. "It's very elegant," she continued, clearly fishing for information. "Is it new?" "Yes. I picked it up specifically for tonight. I thought the occasion deserved something special." Her eyes narrowed slightly as she tried to reconcile my appearance with her understanding of my financial situation. The dress was obviously expensive, but not in an obvious designer label way. It was the kind of understated elegance that actually cost more than flashy pieces with visible logos. "Well, you certainly look lovely," she said finally. "I'm so glad you were able to join us. I know these tickets were a stretch for your budget." "Actually, they weren't," I replied calmly. In fact, I'm considering making an additional donation tonight if I find a cause that speaks to me. The confusion on her face was almost comical. An additional donation? From someone who lived on a widow's pension and needed grocery store gift cards to supplement her food budget? Mark approached us, drink in hand, his expression equally puzzled. Natalie, good to see you. That's quite an upgrade from your usual style. His choice of the word upgrade was telling. It revealed his assumption that my previous clothing choices had been limitations rather than preferences, that I had been dressing poorly because I couldn't afford better rather than because I didn't think expensive clothes were necessary for most occasions. Thank you, I said. I decided it was time for some changes in my life. Changes. Brenda's voice carried a hint of alarm. What kind of changes? Before I could answer, Jonathan's mother joined our group, her face lighting up, with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing me. Natalie, dear, you look absolutely radiant. What a beautiful dress. Her compliment felt different from the others, warmer, less suspicious, more genuinely happy for me. It reminded me why I had always liked her, despite her patronizing tendencies. Her condescension came from a desire to help, not from malice. Thank you, I said, giving her a genuine smile. You look lovely as well. I was just asking Natalie about the changes, she mentioned. Brenda interjected, clearly unwilling to let the subject drop. What kind of changes are you making? The opening was perfect, almost too good to be true. Well, I've recently learned some things about Jonathan that I hadn't known during our marriage. It's changed my perspective on quite a few matters. The three of them exchanged glances. Mark's expression was wary, Brenda's was suspicious, and his mother looked concerned. What kind of things? His mother asked gently. Financial matters mostly? I replied, enjoying the way they all stiffened slightly at the word financial. It turns out Jonathan was much more successful than any of us realized. Much more successful. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see their minds racing, trying to process this information and figure out what it meant for their understanding of the past 3 years. Successful? How? Mark asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Well, I said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Let's just say that I won't be needing any more grocery store gift cards. The champagne flute felt perfect. In my hand, crystal, expensive, filled with something that probably cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a week. But more than that, it felt like a prop and a performance I was finally ready to give. The silent auction provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my changed circumstances without having to explain them directly. I moved through the displays with Jonathan's family trailing behind me, their confusion growing with each item. I examined seriously rather than dismissing as too expensive. A weekend getaway to a luxury spa resort. Starting bid, $500. I wrote down $1,500 without hesitation. Natalie, Brenda whispered urgently. That's quite a lot of money. Are you sure you can afford? I'm sure, I replied calmly. Moving to the next item, a professional photography session for families. Starting bid, $300. I bid $800. A wine tasting tour with overnight accommodations. Starting bid, $700. I wrote down $1,200. With each bid, their alarm grew more visible. Mark kept looking at his wife with raised eyebrows. Jonathan's mother seemed genuinely concerned that I was having some kind of financial breakdown or manic episode. Natalie, dear, she said finally, placing a gentle hand on my arm. Perhaps we should step outside and talk privately. I'm worried that you might be making some decisions you'll regret tomorrow. Her concern was so genuine, so maternal, that I almost felt guilty for the confusion I was causing, almost. I appreciate your worry, I said softly. But I promise you, I'm thinking very clearly right now. Probably more clearly than I have in years. The item that provided the perfect climax to this phase of the evening was a painting donated by a local artist, a beautiful landscape piece with a starting bid of $2,000. The current high bid was $2,500. Written in Brenda's careful handwriting, I picked up the pen and wrote, $10,000. The sharp intake of breath from all three family members was audible, even over the background noise of the party. Brenda's face went pale. Natalie, that's $10,000, she said, as if I might have made a mathematical error. That's a huge amount of money. It's for charity, I replied simply, and it's a beautiful painting. I think it will look lovely in my new home. New home. Mark's voice cracked slightly. I'm thinking of upgrading. The apartment Jonathan and I shared has too many memories. I'm looking at some houses in the better parts of town. This was technically true. Harold Morrison had mentioned that real estate might be a good investment, and I had begun researching properties in neighborhoods I had never dreamed of affording. But I deliberately phrased it in a way that would maximize their confusion and concern. The check I wrote for my auction winnings was the most satisfying piece of paper I had ever signed. $10,800 written out in my careful handwriting on a personal check that bore my name and an account number, linked to funds they couldn't even begin to imagine. As I handed the check to the volunteer coordinator, I was aware of 3 pairs of eyes watching every movement, analyzing every detail, trying to solve a puzzle that didn't match any of their assumptions about my life or circumstances. "This is very generous of you," the coordinator said with genuine gratitude. "The Children's Hospital will benefit tremendously from donations like this." "It's my pleasure," I replied. "I believe in supporting good causes when you have the means." To do so, the phrase, "when you have the means," was carefully chosen. It implied resources without specifying their source or extent. It suggested capability without bragging. And it left Jonathan's family with more questions than answers. Brenda cornered me as we returned to our table for dinner. "To ask you directly, where is this money coming from? 3 months ago, you were using coupons at the grocery store. Tonight, you're writing checks for $10,000. What has changed?" Her directness was refreshing after years of passive-aggressive hints and suggestions. Finally, she was asking the questions instead of making assumptions. "What's changed?" I said slowly, meeting her eyes directly, "is that I've learned the truth about several things I thought I understood, including the truth about Jonathan's financial situation when he died." "What truth?" she demanded. I smiled, the expression feeling natural for the first time in years. "All in good time, Brenda." "In good time?" The dinner conversation was stilted, filled with unspoken questions and careful observations. I could feel them watching everything I did, the way I ordered wine without checking prices, the way I left generous tips for the servers, the way I carried myself with confidence instead of apologetic gratitude. By dessert, their confusion had transformed into something closer to panic. They were beginning to realize that their fundamental understanding of the past 3 years might be completely wrong. The breaking point came during coffee service, when Brenda could no longer contain her frustration and anxiety. She leaned across the table, her voice low but intense. "Natalie, enough games. You need to tell us what's going on. 3 months ago, you couldn't afford a decent winter coat. Tonight, you're bidding $10,000 on paintings. Either you've lost your mind or you're hiding something significant from us." The moment felt electric. Mark and his wife leaned in. Jonathan's mother set down her coffee cup with shaking hands, and the other guests at nearby tables began to sense the tension at our table. "You're right," I said calmly. "I have been hiding something, but not by choice." I reached into my clutch and withdrew my phone, opening the banking app that I had downloaded just that morning. The account balance was clearly visible on the screen. $18,700,000. I set the phone on the table, screen facing up, and watched their expressions change from confusion to shock to disbelief. That can't be real," Mark stammered. "That's almost $19 million. $18.7 million, to be precise," I confirmed. "From a trust fund that Jonathan established before his death? A trust fund that I knew nothing about until his attorney contacted me last week." The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Brenda stared at the phone screen as if it might change if she looked at it long enough. Mark's mouth was literally hanging open. Jonathan's mother had gone completely pale. "A trust fund," his mother whispered. "Jonathan had a trust fund?" "Jonathan had many things," I replied quietly. "He was extremely successful in his consulting work, made excellent investments, and accumulated significant wealth over the years we were married. Wealth that he kept hidden from all of us, including me, because he wanted our relationships too." "You rented that tiny apartment, drove that old car, shopped at thrift stores by choice?" I interrupted. "Jonathan's choice, and mine, by extension. He wanted us to build a life based on love and shared values, not on material luxury. He wanted to protect our marriage from the complications that wealth can bring to relationships." I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "He also wanted to protect me from people who might treat me differently if they knew about his financial success, people who might see me as a meal ticket rather than as a person worthy of respect and genuine affection." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clearly understood. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Brenda's face flushed red. Jonathan's mother looked as if she might cry. "The trust was designed to remain private for 3 years after his death," I continued. 3 years during which I would learn to navigate widowhood on my own, discover my own strength and independence, and observe how the people in his life truly felt about me when they thought I had nothing to offer them. "Natalie," his mother began, her voice cracking. "It's been an enlightening 3 years," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the emotions churning inside me. "I've learned who offers help out of genuine kindness and who offers charity wrapped in condescension. I've learned the difference Between people who include you in their lives because they value your presence and people who exclude you because they find your circumstances embarrassing, Brenda was staring at her hands, her face burning with shame. We weren't trying to, weren't you? I asked gently. When you slipped me grocery store gift cards with that pitying smile, weren't you reminding me of my place in your hierarchy? When you seated me at the children's table during family dinners, weren't you making it clear that I no longer belonged with the adults? When you discussed expensive vacations and purchases in front of me, weren't you emphasizing what I couldn't afford? The truth was painful, but it needed to be spoken. For 3 years I had swallowed their condescension and convinced myself it was kindness. Tonight, with the security of financial independence, I could finally name their behavior for what it had been. We thought we were helping, Mark said weakly. You thought you were superior, I corrected. And maybe that made it easier to feel better about your own financial struggles. The final revelation required one more artifact: the official trust fund certificate that Harold Morrison had given me to keep for my records. I withdrew it from my clutch, unfolding the heavy paper with its official seals and legal language, and placed it next to my phone on the table. This is the document that changed everything, I said quietly. The Jonathan Thompson Irrevocable Trust established 8 months before his death, with me as the sole beneficiary. $18.7 million, protected and invested. For 3 years while I learned to survive on my own, Brenda reached for the document with trembling hands, scanning the legal text as if she could find some loophole or mistake that would make it less real. This says he was worth how? Is this possible? We never knew he had this kind of money, because he didn't want you to know, I replied. He told me in a letter he left with his attorney that he had seen what wealth did to his family. The jealousy, the manipulation, the way money changed how people saw each other and themselves. He wanted to protect our marriage from those complications. Jonathan's mother was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks. I gave you those gift cards, she whispered. All this time I thought I was helping you, and you were. I was wealthy beyond anything you could imagine. I finished for her, but I was also grieving, and I was learning to be independent. And I was discovering who truly cared about me as a person versus who saw me as a burden or an object of pity. The weight of their collective guilt was almost tangible. I could see them replaying 3 years of interactions through this new lens, understanding how their charity must have felt to someone who had been secretly far wealthier than any of them. The cruelest part, I continued, wasn't the condescension itself. It was that you based your treatment of me on assumptions about my worth as a person. When you thought I was poor, I became less important, less worthy of inclusion, less deserving of respect. You measured my value by my perceived bank account balance. Mark found his voice first. We didn't mean we weren't trying to hurt you. We thought we were being kind. Were you being kind when you seated me at the children's table at Thanksgiving? When you discussed vacation plans I supposedly couldn't afford right in front of me? When you made jokes about my thrift store clothes and my coupon clipping, the examples piled up between us like evidence in a trial. Each memory carried new weight, now that the context had changed completely. I understand that you were struggling with your own financial pressures, I said, looking at each of them in turn. Brenda, I know about the second mortgage you took out to pay for that Mediterranean cruise. Mark, I know the lake house is a timeshare you can barely afford and the boat was repossessed 6 months ago. I know you were all dealing with your own money problems, while assuming I was the only one in the family who was financially vulnerable. Their faces reflected shame, embarrassment, and the dawning realization that I had done my own research into their circumstances. But here's what I learned during these 3 years of being treated as your charity case. Wealth doesn't determine worth, character does, integrity does. How you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you that reveals who you really are. I stood up from the table, smoothing my expensive dress, and looked down at them with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Jonathan protected me from this truth for years, but he also gave me the tools to handle it when the time came. He gave me financial security, yes, but more importantly, he gave me 3 years to discover my own strength, my own worth, my own ability to survive and thrive without anyone else's approval or support. The trust fund certificate crinkled as I folded it and returned it to my clutch. The money is nice, but the real gift was learning that I don't need your acceptance or your charity or your condescending kindness. I know who I am now without millions in the bank. I picked up my phone and my clutch, preparing to leave. The question now is whether you can figure out who you are when you're not busy feeling superior to someone you thought was beneath you. The silence at the table was deafening, but I could hear murmurs from nearby tables as other guests began to realize that some kind of family drama was unfolding. The gala continued around us, but our small corner of the ballroom had become the site of a reckoning, 3 years in the making. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened and to prepare for what would inevitably come next. My phone had already buzzed twice with text messages, but I wasn't ready to read them yet. I needed space to think, to feel, to understand what justice looked like. When it finally arrived after 3 years of patience, the messages started in earnest the next morning. Brenda's text came first. "We need to talk. Please call me. I'm so sorry." Then Mark, "Can we meet for lunch? I owe you an apology." And finally, Jonathan's mother, "My dear, I don't know what to say. I feel terrible about everything. Please, let me make this right." But it was the items that began arriving at my door that truly revealed the depth of their panic and shame. The first package contained every grocery store gift card I had ever used, carefully saved and returned to me. With a note from Jonathan's mother, "I should never have presumed you needed these. I'm mortified by my own assumptions." The returned gift cards were more than just pieces of plastic. They were artifacts of our entire relationship dynamic, symbols of how she had seen me and how I had allowed myself to be seen. Looking at them, spread across my kitchen table, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. She had meant well, but good intentions didn't erase the impact of condescending behavior. Brenda's package was larger and more desperate. Inside were photos from every family gathering I had attended, dozens of pictures where I had been cropped out or excluded from the final versions shared on social media. She had printed them all and included a note. "I saved these because deep down, I knew it was wrong to exclude you. I don't know why I did it. Please forgive me." The photos were painful to look through. In many of them, I could see myself trying so hard to fit in, to be grateful, to accept whatever scraps of inclusion they offered. I looked small in these pictures, diminished, apologetic for taking up space. The woman in these photos bore little resemblance to the confident person I had become. Mark's attempt at reconciliation was the most practical and the most telling about his character. He arrived at my door with a business proposal and investment opportunity in his construction company that would benefit us both. Even in apology, he was still trying to figure out how to profit from my situation. "Mark," I said gently, as I invited him in, "do you understand what you're doing right now?" He looked confused. "I'm offering you a chance to diversify your portfolio while helping family business grow. You're trying to find a way to benefit from the very wealth you spent 3 years ignoring or dismissing. Even now, you're not seeing me as a person deserving of respect. You're seeing me as a resource to be tapped." The realization dawned slowly. Across his face, I didn't think of it that way. "I know you didn't. That's exactly the problem." The most genuine response came from Jonathan's mother, who appeared at my door 3 days after the gala, with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice. She didn't bring gifts or proposals or explanations. She brought only herself and her grief. "I loved Jonathan like my own son," she said, sitting in my living room and accepting the tea I offered. "But I failed to love his wife the way he would have wanted me to. I treated you like a charity case when I should have treated you like family. I made you feel small when you were already in pain." Her apology felt different from the others, less about her own guilt and more about genuine recognition of harm caused. "I can't undo 3 years of making you feel less than," she continued, "but I want you to know that it was never about you not being good enough. It was about my own fears and insecurities, my own need to feel useful and important by being needed." This conversation was the hardest because her motivations had been the most complex. She hadn't been cruel out of malice, but out of her own emotional needs. She had treated me like a child who needed protection because it made her feel valuable and necessary. "I understand," I said finally, "but understanding doesn't erase the impact. For 3 years, I believed I was the person you all saw dependent, pitiable, grateful for scraps of attention. That belief shaped how I saw myself and how I moved through the world." "How do I fix this?" she asked. "You start by seeing me as I actually am," I replied. "Not who you think I should be, not who you need me to be, but who I actually am. A complete person with my own thoughts, feelings, capabilities, and worth." The consequences for each family member reflected their individual characters. Brenda retreated into embarrassed silence, unable to face the gap between her self-image as a kind person and her actual behavior. Mark continued trying to find angles and opportunities, never quite grasping that our relationship couldn't be transactional. Jonathan's mother began the slow work of rebuilding genuine connection based on mutual respect, rather than assumed hierarchy. But the most important consequence was internal. I no longer needed their approval or acceptance to feel worthy. I had learned to validate myself. 6 months after the gala, I was arranging flowers in my new home when Jonathan's mother called to ask if she could visit. Our relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, with both of us working to establish new patterns based on mutual respect, rather than assumed need. "I have something I'd like to show you," she said when she arrived, carrying a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo I had never seen before: Jonathan and me at our wedding. "I kept this on my mantelpiece for 5 years," she said quietly. "After he died, I put it away because it made me too sad. But recently, I realized it wasn't sadness. I was feeling it. Was envy. You two had something so pure, so genuine, and I was jealous of that connection. I think that jealousy influenced how I treated you after his death." The photo would become the centerpiece of my new family photo collection, not because it was expensive or impressive, but because it represented authentic love and joy. It reminded me of who Jonathan and I had been together, and who I was becoming on my own. About what you said regarding character and integrity, you were right. How we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer reveals who we really are. I don't like who I was revealed to be. People can change, I said. The question hung between us, honest and vulnerable. I considered it carefully before answering. About or feel sorry for. I need to be the person you respect and enjoy spending time with. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I'd like that very much. Our new relationship required conscious effort from both of us. She had to resist her impulses to worry about my finances, to offer unsolicited advice, or to treat me like someone who needed protection. I had to resist the habit of minimizing myself or being overly grateful for normal kindness. Brenda's journey was more complicated, but her apologies were often followed by attempts to explain or justify her actions. Money was tight, and I guess I took out my frustrations on you, but I always cared about you, Natalie. You have to believe that. Caring about someone and treating them with respect are different things, I replied. You can care about someone and still harm them if you don't examine your own motivations and behaviors. She wasn't ready to do that level of self-examination yet. Maybe she never would be. I had learned that I couldn't force people to grow or change. I could only control my own responses and boundaries. Mark's response was the most predictable. When it became clear that I wasn't interested in his business ventures or investment opportunities, his attention quickly shifted elsewhere. I had become useful to him only as a potential source of capital, and when that didn't materialize, I returned to being largely invisible in his world. But there were new relationships too. Harold Morrison introduced me to his wife, and through her, I met a group of women who had navigated their own complex relationships with wealth and family. Some were widows like me, others were divorcees or women who had built their own fortunes. What we shared was an understanding of how money complicated human relationships and the importance of knowing who loved you for yourself versus who loved what you could provide. These women became my closest friends, not because we shared similar bank account balances, but because we shared similar values about authenticity, integrity, and the courage required to be yourself, regardless of other people's expectations or assumptions. The most meaningful new relationship was with myself. My own perceptions, to value my own company, to pursue my own interests without needing external validation. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now owned every room she entered. I started a foundation in Jonathan's name, focusing on supporting widows and widowers who were navigating the practical and emotional challenges of sudden loss. The work gave me purpose and connected me with people who understood grief not as something to be pitied, but as a universal human experience that could lead to profound growth and strength. Through the foundation, had been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed because of their circumstances. We shared stories of resilience, of discovering inner resources we hadn't known we possessed, of learning that our worth was never dependent on other people's recognition or approval. One evening, I came across a letter from a young mother whose husband had died in a car accident. Her words reminded me of my own early grief. I feel invisible, like I don't matter to anyone anymore. People who used to be friends now avoid me because my sadness makes them uncomfortable, or they try to help in ways that make me feel small and broken. I called her that night and invited her to coffee. I want to tell you something important, I said. You matter. You matter. Because you exist, because you're fighting to build a life for yourself and your children. Seeing myself reflected in her experience, but from the perspective of someone who had traveled through that darkness and emerged stronger, helped me understand how completely my own journey had transformed me. I was no longer the woman who needed other people's validation to feel valuable. I had become the woman who could offer validation to others who needed to hear it. 1 year after the gala revelation, I stood in the hospital garden where Jonathan and I had decided to place a memorial bench in his honor. The dedication plaque was simple but perfect, in memory of Jonathan Thompson, who protected what mattered most and believed in the power of authentic love. The bench had become more than a memorial. It was a symbol of everything I had learned about love, loss, dignity, and self-worth. Jonathan had protected me from his family's judgment during our marriage, but he had also given me the tools to protect myself after his death. The 3-year waiting period for the trust hadn't been about money. It had been about giving me time to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations or assumptions. Harold Morrison joined me at the bench dedication ceremony, along with several friends from my foundation work and Jonathan's mother, who had become genuinely supportive rather than conditionally kind. Brenda and Mark had been invited but chose not to attend, which felt appropriate. Some relationships couldn't be rebuilt, and that was okay too. Jonathan would be proud of what you've built, Harold said, as we watched children play in the hospital garden nearby. The foundation, the new relationships, the way you've used your resources to help others, it's exactly what he hoped would happen. He knew me better than I knew myself, I replied. He understood that I needed to learn my own strength before I could handle his wealth responsibly. The memorial bench plaque caught the afternoon sunlight, its words a permanent reminder of the man who had loved me enough to hide $18 million so that I could discover I was worth far more than money could ever measure. Looking back on the journey from that first humiliating family dinner to this moment of quiet celebration, I could see how every painful experience had been necessary. The condescension had taught me to recognize genuine kindness. The exclusion had taught me to value authentic inclusion. The financial struggle had taught me that dignity wasn't dependent on bank account balances. Most importantly, had taught me never to underestimate others. The foundation was thriving, having helped over 200 families navigate the early stages of widowhood, with both practical support and emotional encouragement. I had learned that my experience wasn't unique. Many people faced assumptions and judgments about their worth based on their circumstances, their appearance, their perceived limitations or vulnerabilities. The most dangerous assumption, I told a group of social workers at a conference the previous month, is that someone's current situation reflects their permanent value or potential. People are not their circumstances. They are not their bank accounts. They are not their grief or their struggles or their temporary limitations. They are complex human beings deserving of respect regardless of what they appear to have or lack. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my foundation friends. Saw your interview in the paper today. You're famous. Also, my kids want to know if rich people really do eat different food or if that's just in movies. I laughed, remembering how foreign wealth had felt when I first learned about the trust. Now, it was simply a tool useful for accomplishing goals and helping others, but not a source of identity or I was still the same person who enjoyed thrift store treasures and homemade meals, who found joy in simple pleasures and meaningful conversations. The difference was that I now knew these preferences were choices rather than limitations, and I carried myself accordingly as the sun set over the hospital garden. I thought about Jonathan's final gift to me, not just the money, but the journey to discover that I was valuable with or without it. He had understood something I was still learning, that protecting someone you love sometimes means giving them the space to discover their own strength, even when that process is painful to witness. Thank you, I whispered to the memorial plaque, knowing he couldn't hear me but needing to say the words anyway, for seeing who I could become before I could see it myself. The bench would remain here long after I was gone, a quiet testament to authentic love and the courage required to let people discover their own worth. And maybe, someday, it would offer comfort to another person who needed to remember that their value was never determined by anyone else's recognition or approval. It was determined by their own capacity for growth, kindness, and resilience. If you've ever felt invisible or underestimated by people who should have seen your worth, remember this: your value doesn't decrease based on someone else's inability to see it. Like and subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share your own experiences in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we all matter, regardless of what we appear to have or lack. The woman who once lived on a widow's pension and now managed an $18 million trust had learned that the most important wealth was the kind that couldn't be deposited in banks: the wealth of self-knowledge, authentic relationships, and the unshakable understanding that your worth as a human being is not negotiable.